This program is proudly brought to you by Daytech Limited and the National Information and Communications Technology Authority. In this edition of In Focus, we examine the infiltration of transnational crime into Papua New Guinea. We are joined by Daniel Baulch, former Commissioner for the Independent Commission Against Corruption and retired detective at the Australian Federal Police. Daniel Baulch, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Malcolm.
Now, firstly, Daniel, can you give us a bit of background and history into your career in law enforcement?
Yeah, for sure. Look, it's been a long journey for me, starting all the way back in last millennia. Back in 1999, I graduated from the Victoria Police Academy. Very quickly, I worked out that I really loved investigating. It was really one of the key things I loved doing. And so naturally, I graduated towards being a detective. A lot of work in drug investigations, organised crime was where I really specialised in my early days, then progressing into anti-corruption work. Following from that, I did spend a bit of time at the Victorian Electoral Commission in the lead up to the 2022 election in regulating elections and setting up an investigative function for them. And so that was a really interesting sojourn for me. Following that, spent a bit of time at WorkSafe Victoria, again, looking at workplace injuries and fatalities in the workplace, before making my journey to Papua New Guinea, where I was very happy as one of the inaugural commissioners of the Independent Commission Against Corruption. Sadly, unfortunately for me, it seems that the political will in PNG wasn't quite there, and we were sort of ultimately forced out, which, you know, to an extent, I do sort of hold a bit of account to the current government. My journey now is I'm a private consultant. So whilst I specialise in regulatory integrity, criminal justice, all those type of things, anti-corruption, I do it privately, and I do that through my business, Integrity Solve, and I'm also a co-founder of a regulatory tech business called True Comply, where we're looking to bring some really advanced solutions to the way in which people can regulate and also verify and do due diligence. And it's something I'm really passionate about because, you know, I think a lot of these systems-wide issues, like we're going to talk about today, can be solved with some of those solutions.
Transnational crimes is what most Papua New Guineans see in Hollywood films and movies. However, when people say transnational crime in Papua New Guinea, what kinds of activities are most prevalent currently?
Yeah, Malcolm, it's interesting. Look, for me, one of the headline activities, and it's one of the highest value ones, is corruption itself. And while people sort of look at it and go, well, how does the corruption that happens within Papua New Guinea, within politics and within government actually spread out transnationally? And the way that works is through the laundering of money. That's absolutely critical. So there is really, really clear money flows into Australia, Singapore. I've seen it into South Africa as well too, and that's quite obvious. The other way in which it does do, and this is probably the more fascinating one for a lot of Papua New Guineans, and it is that sort of thing where we talk about the mafia, those type of movies as well too, is Papua New Guinea has very much become a waypoint for drug trafficking and other illicit commodities. Transnational crime is really interesting. It's driven by the money. And so it's whatever commodity that there's money in at the moment, that's where crime tends to go. So we're seeing it with a little bit of illicit tobacco. Well, not a little bit of illicit tobacco in Australia. It's quite huge and a big, big part of organised crime. In PNG, that's also happening. But for me, the biggest one at the moment is the movement of large quantities of drugs. And what we're really seeing is a lot of those drugs are coming out of South America. So nations like Mexico, Colombia, and the Pacific is their waypoint. And PNG poses a really, really high vulnerability to a country like Australia. And that's just geographically. It's very, very close. The border between PNG and Australia is very, very poorly protected. And the value of drugs like cocaine in Australia is immense. When you look at what a quantity of cocaine, say a kilo of cocaine comes out of South America at $5,000 US a kilo, we're talking a value in Australia, a wholesale value of well over $100,000 for a kilo. And so that's quite critical. And that puts a lot of margin in that for crime groups. And that's where PNG becomes quite a valuable waypoint. And the same is true of methamphetamine. And we've seen that in recent years with things like the so-called black flights, where non-commercial planes, small aircraft are used to carry substantial amounts of drugs via air into the top end of Australia.
Now, you touched on a lot of the illicit drugs coming out of South America and Southeast Asia. In the context of Papua New Guinea, where do these transnational criminal networks originate from, and how do they connect with local actors in PNG?
Yeah, look, that's a really fascinating one as well too, Malcolm. They are actually European-based. So when we talk about things like the mafia or the Ndreda, that is very much a live issue. We've seen that in recent cases in Papua New Guinea where Italian nationals were actually connected to the cases, were sent to prison. I believe in one case was actually released on medical grounds and has since returned back to Italy. But I'm well aware, and having spoken to a few of my sources, that there was a really, really clear link to a head of a mafia crime group, or the Ndreda, back in Calabria. And that is, something that probably hasn't been fully explored. But there is that really, really triangle sort of link when you look at it's facilitated out of those European destinations. And in the case of a drug like cocaine, it's then coordinated back through the cartels in South America. So Mexico, while not necessarily a massive producer of cocaine originally, very much a trafficking waypoint. And that's where, whilst the drugs will never physically leave Italy or leave somewhere like Europe, they will transact from South America via a place like Colombia or Mexico, through the Pacific, through something like PNG, which is obviously very, very porous in terms of the ability to get a relatively small boat, landed in somewhere like Port Moresby and on through to Australia. Sometimes the drugs might be transported up to places like we've seen Morobe province being used, and then with the use of aircraft flying it into Australia. So that's a really, really simplified version of what the model looks like. But each person in that chain plays a really, really important point. What we often see is that it's the people who are at the higher end of those crime groups won't go what we call hands-on with the drugs. So they're never the transporter, they're never the mule, and that limits their risks of exposure to law enforcement. And so therefore, when we see, actions of people like the AFP, and to a much, much lesser extent, the RPNGC, actually arrest some of these people and have an impact, they're not getting the top of the tree. They're usually getting someone who's paid whilst quite well. When you look at the context of the profitability of the deal, it's next to nothing what they're making.
It's a good segue into my next question, and it's around the level of sophistication of these transnational criminal networks. What can you tell us about them?
Yeah, look, they're very, very well schooled in infiltrating things like policing, infiltrating things like government. And that's through some really, really initial, what they'll do is they'll gather small favours. So the moment that they pay off a government official, a politician, a police officer, whether it be small, large amounts, and still relatively small though overall, I'd say, they essentially then own them. They know they've got a valuable pipeline where they can manipulate systems, take a level of control, and that causes breakdowns in the ability of the system to actually fight these type of crimes. Because if everyone in those law enforcement teams, and there's not the political will of the government to seriously deal with these things, same with the issues of corruption as well too, nothing's going to happen. We're just going to see an absolute fall down. And I think whilst overall the sophistication is still quite rudimentary in terms of things like it still requires aircraft, it requires just a physical boat, and at the end of the day, drugs are a physical product, so you've still got to have somewhere to store them. So you're looking at a physical premises or location in somewhere like PNG. If it doesn't automatically stay on a boat and then continue on to Australia, or alternatively, if they then have to move it across land in PNG, that also poses challenges because obviously the road network in PNG is quite difficult, and they're going to have to move large amount of quantities by vehicle. But it really boils down to people. It's the people in those groups and their ability to influence, to stop law enforcement, or just to basically bribe their way through, is where the sophisticated part happens in Papua New Guinea.
Would it be fair to assume that there is some level and degree of collusion between these transnational criminal networks and our local law enforcement agencies in Papua New Guinea?
100%. Like I'm not even saying it's fair to say, it is what's happening. I've personally seen evidence of senior Papua New Guinean police who have been paid bribes by organised crime figures. And I'm well aware that agencies like the Australian Federal Police actually have this information in their possession. And this is quite the complex thing in terms of the way in which the trust relationship between the AFP and the RPNGC works. When it boils down and you look at it, they essentially don't trust them. And frankly, even my time at ICAC, I don't trust the RPNGC. Whilst I had good working relationships with some individual members of the RPNGC, it's absolutely evident that corruption is rife in the RPNGC. And that's at every level. And I'm talking about even the basic, someone wants to report a crime in PNG and they're paying the police 50 kina for the privilege to actually have them do something. That's not a paid service. That's a free job. And so when you look at it, at that high level, and these people are paying thousands, and we've got organised crime figures who are not only infiltrated into the business network within government, but also paying, let's say, gratuities, but let's put it how it really is. It's a bribe to senior police. Of course, the enforcement's not happening.
Based on your knowledge, what specific criminal organisations in Australia have a presence in Papua New Guinea?
Yeah, so it's really funny. We talk about criminal organisations in Australia, and criminal organisations in Australia are really, really quite fluid. So if I go back to my organised crime days in Victoria, and we had a couple distinct groups. And what we saw there, we had what was called the Carlton Crew, which is very much geographically based, but it's a loose term around a core group of senior criminal figures who are in the Melbourne underworld. And then we had even the Carl Williams cohort, which was another group of cohort connected with the Mockbell family. And I must stress, this is all allegations, and none of this is necessarily, there is some stuff which is still happening even in Victorian courts today regarding these matters. But they are very, very loose groups. And so the way in which these groups traditionally formed was that if there was value in one crime group, if someone had access to a supply of drugs, a supply of money, or the market was there, or in the case of tobacco these days, that market's there, they would work with each other. It's only when there became disputes over, the financial profit that these things become quite violent and there's fallout. And we're seeing this in Australia at the moment with lots of standover tactics used with, fire bombings, even the good old sort of protection rackets that are happening with the bombings of venues and fire bombings of venues in Victoria at the moment and other places in Australia. But from that, we've also seen the evolution of Middle Eastern organised crime, which is absolutely spread out across Australia over the last 25 years. Really, the heart of that was Western Sydney. That's now branched out quite substantially and across all parts, even to the point back in, about 2015, I think it was, when I was working in a crime intelligence area in Victoria Police. We had a really clear understanding that the Middle Eastern organised crime had actually moved into this space of transporting drugs via plane out of Papua New Guinea. And so that's critical. And then within it as well too, there's the mix of the outlaw motorcycle gangs as well. The traditional mafia groups are all sort of involved. So in terms of strict lanes, whilst it feels like there are some, it's very, very fluid. I describe it, it's almost like politics in PNG where people will change teams when it's very much in their favour to do so. And crime groups are the same in Australia.
Now, Daniel, moving to the international flow of illegal narcotics within the region, Pacific Island countries like Papua New Guinea and Fiji have traditionally been transit points for these transnational criminal networks for the movement of the illegal drugs. Based on your assessment, how much of those drugs would you say comes through Papua New Guinea?
Look, it's really, really hard to say. And this is even globally, nationally in Australia, determining the rate of drug transportation to Australia is really, really hard. And so generally what we would look at, and quite often the figure I would look at is, well, what's the inspection rate of, say, cargo going through a country like Australia? So realistically, Border Force is somewhere between, and it's been a while since I've checked this figure, but it's around about 1% or less of cargo that's actually inspected by Border Force. And so that's through your ports and your traditional cargo movements. Then you look at the smaller movements, which is what the drug transactions that happen through PNG. They're not necessarily coming through the waypoints that say someone like Customs in PNG, and I must say, shout out to David Tao, the Chief Commissioner of Customs. David actually does do a fantastic job with what he's resourced within that organisation, but it's incredibly hard to stop. When people are moving these things, on their person, either through flights, and we've seen it even with the transition of heavy metals and money as well too. It's very hard to quantify. But on an individual case-by-case basis, when we look at the quantities of drugs, we're talking about the hundreds of kilos. And generally speaking, rule of thumb for what I'd say, and we've seen this with what they call the shotgun import approach, and this is something that generated out of Nigeria, where they would send packages of drugs, whether it be cocaine, methamphetamine, just as simple as a method through the post. So they'd send 10 kilos in 1 kilo packs. And of those 10 kilo packs, they'd work off the assumption that one pack at most would get intercepted. Therefore, you've got 9 kilos of cocaine, which is transitioned through. And theoretically, you're going to have to take that model across through what's happening in PNG. What assurance would we actually have that we actually know how many of these shipments are actually happening? And who's to say that these shipments aren't happening on, let's say, one a month even? And if we looked at one a month at 500 kilos, that's a lot of drugs which can, pass through PNG. In terms of other Pacific nations, I haven't really seen as much in places like PNG. Anecdotally, I've heard of people considering those other smaller islands as waypoints as well too. But at the same time too, you've got to have a waypoint which has got sufficient infrastructure in which you can either refuel your boat, restock up again, hold the drugs somewhere, in a warehouse or a house somewhere, transact, the currency if you want to do that as well too. They're the really key points. And so you still need a level of development, but, you still look for an under-resourced law enforcement sector and also a law enforcement sector which is very easily corrupted.
Yes, then we've seen arrests made and allegations around the illegal smuggling of gold out of Papua New Guinea. What would you say has sort of prompted this illegal activity to come about in Papua New Guinea?
I think it's the movement of wealth, and that's what it boils down to. Somehow you've got to get the money out, and gold is something that absolutely retains its valuable. Extremely hard to trace as well too when it's converted back to its let's say gold bars, its solid format. Very, very hard to show what they call ultimate beneficial ownership. It's the same as what cash is. And the problem with the instability with the kina and the currency in PNG, no one wants to hold their wealth in kina. And that's so with criminal groups as well too. They're not going to keep it in kina. They want it in Aussie dollar. They want it in US dollars most definitely. They want it in Singaporean dollars. And a quick and easy way to get it out of there is through gold. And whilst I'm not casting aspersions over one nationality or another, we have seen a lot of that in recent arrests with Chinese nationals. It is also quite common. And I must say, look, credit where credit's due. I do commend Customs because they have managed to intercept a large amount of that illicit gold. The challenge is, again, though, we've got no idea around what gold is actually leaving the country. And the other challenge also as well too, some of that gold is just straight out gold, which has just been ripped out of, Bagheera and other mines as well too, where it's just straight theft of gold. And so that in itself is another issue as well too. Well, what stability do we have around the resources sector, which is, one of the biggest, if not the biggest sector in PNG? What protections in that industry? How do we know that that's actually functioning the way it should and that Papua New Guinea is protecting the wealth for its people?
Over the years, we've had the Royal Papua New Guinea Constabulary and the Australian and Federal Police signing various partnerships which have involved joint operations as well as information and intelligence sharing. How effective has this partnership been?
Not at all is the way I describe it. Personally, I was involved in operations where the AFP are selective in who they talk to and why they talk to them. And there were times when, and I've had some really, really honest conversations with the liaison officers in PNG at times when they failed to give a call to me around a particular operation where they knew we had an interest at the ICAC. One example was where some RPNGC officers were basically standing over some alleged drug traffickers and trying to extort them for money, to take their boat off them. No real interest in actually capturing, the drugs or getting them on the criminal charges. They were just looking for their own wealth, and that was tied up with Drug Enforcement Agency intelligence from the US, who I must say I did have a few conversations with them, although I can't disclose, the content of that. Really, really good, highly professional. And that's, to be honest, where a lot of the information that the AFP act upon, I forecast, comes from, is the DEA and other international agencies with who they have good partnership relationships with. There's a real reality that the AFP aren't gathering intelligence themselves actively on the ground, which is indicating what the drug flow is coming out of South America or Europe through places like Papua New Guinea. That's through their partner agencies, and that's effective. But the reality is the AFP simply don't trust the RPNGC, much in the same way that I don't trust them. And they're very, very, it makes it a very, very challenging relationship. So, it hasn't been effective. And there's also some really, really restrictive things in the way in which, let's look at the AFP partnership program they have with the RPNGC. So that's a really, really visible partnership program, but it has absolutely zero impact on crime in PNG, and especially organised crime. That's not what that relationship is there for. And if people are thinking that that's having an impact on transnational crime, that's laughable. It all boils down to who are the liaison officers in PNG, and what is it that Canberra, at the head of the AFP and their operations areas, are actually willing to disclose to the RPNGC and act upon. Having said that, they still do things like they try to give them support, through things like even what's called Celebrite. So a software solution and a tool that allows the extraction of data from mobile phones. And again, the skills in the RPNGC are simply not there to execute that type of investigation. They've just got no experience in it. And that's just the broad, honest truth around it. It's policing at a whole other level of which they have absolutely no idea of what to do. And if I'm really, really honest, they've got no desire to do it. They're just in it for whatever suits themselves. And, in a police force that's underpaid, notoriously corrupt, you're going to keep getting the same outcomes.
Daniel Baulch, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Malcolm.
This program was proudly brought to you by Daytech Limited and the National Information and Communications Technology Authority.